Okay, so again, welcome everyone. And this is the War Industry Resistors Network. My name is Ken Jones, and I've been working ever since the beginning, about a year and a half ago, with our network. We have a great webinar this evening. It's on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as tools of empire. We have three great presenters from different parts of the world. Somebody here in the US, I'll introduce them in a minute, someone from Honduras and someone from the Philippines. So we're excited about this. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Paul Shannon, who's going to give us a lowdown on what we are as War Industry Resistors Network. So go ahead, Paul.
Okay, well, thank you, Ken, and welcome everyone. Our War Industry Resistors Network is a network of dozens of local groups who are focused on military companies in their local area. What we try to do is coordinate between these groups. Occasionally, we try to organize national actions, but mainly we try to keep in touch with each other, find out what each other is doing, and find out what types of resources might be helpful to these different groups. Whereas much of the organizing action against empire and against war comes with a focus on Congress and the administration. Here, the groups in our network realize that a lot of the power behind the throne is really these military companies. Not only do they make the weapons, not only do they make huge profits off of those weapons, but they also are placed strategically throughout the government and throughout other institutions in society, and actually are one of, if not the key player in the formulation of United States foreign policy. And this would be true, for instance, of what's happening in Ukraine. It was true of what's happening in Yemen. It's true of what's happening in Iraq. The Secretary of Defense, of course, General Austin, was right out of the Raytheon Board of Directors. But that's just the most visible piece of this. So we focus on the fact that of the tremendous power that these war companies have over our society and our lives. If you kind of share that perspective, we hope that you will sign up and become either an individual or a group member of our network. The more people and organizations we have, the more effective we can be. And so would invite all of you to do that. Ken, a little later on, is going to show you how to get one of these wonderful shirts, because if you're a member, obviously you have to have the right shirt. And so you'll have that opportunity to be the first in your neighborhood or your group to actually be an official member of the War Industry Resistors Network. The last thing I'll say is I'm going to put in the chat the link to our website. And you will find
it in there, Paul.
Oh, you did already. Okay, great. I'll put it in again. I enjoy doing that. So please look at this website. There's great resources there. The one thing I will mention is that we have organized about 10 webinars so far, all of which focus on different ways, different connections that war industries have to what's going on in the world. And tonight we're looking at one dimension. We've looked at think tanks. We've looked at all kinds of ways that these war companies affect our lives. And I think you'll find tremendous information there, how they're affecting our campuses, for instance. So I think I've spoken enough. Please look at that website when you can, and please look at our past webinars so that you can see the types of resources that we have that you can use for educational purposes. And tonight's webinar will also be recorded, and you will get an email sometime after later on this week, maybe, with a link to that recording. So if you want other people to watch it, and or you want to watch it again yourself, you can do so. So Ken, I think we should kind of get started.
Good. Thanks so much, Paul. And yeah, that's right. We have merch. And if you want one of these great shirts, I'm going to put my email. There's my email in the chat. And I just want to also mention that we do these monthly webinars. So next month we have one lined up, and it will be Bruce Gagnon and Dave Webb from the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. And the topic is the militarization of space. So I hope you can come. It's on July 20th, and we'll put a registration link in the chat. So let me introduce our speakers. We have three, as I mentioned. Elaine Zuckerman is going to be our first speaker. She's president of Gender Action, which is an advocacy campaign holding international finance institutions accountable to harmful gender and climate impacts. And our second speaker will be Liza Maza, who is living in the Philippines, and it's morning there. And she is a social activist and development worker. She's the general secretary of the International League of People's Struggle, the ILPS, and works to develop friendship and solidarity with peoples and organizations fighting for national sovereignty and social liberation. She's also the chair emerita of Gabriela Women's Alliance and the International Women's Alliance, and spokesperson of the Council for People's Development and Governance. Third speaker, some of you may know here in the US, is Ben Norton. He actually is living in Honduras now. Is an investigative journalist and analyst. He's the founder and editor of Geopolitical Economy Report, and based in Latin America. These are thumbnail sketches. I'm going to put in the chat their bios from their website or the Wikipedia site, one or the other, and you can look. Each one of them has an extensive resume. I'll let you look for yourself. So at this point, if you would, Elaine, go ahead and take it over.
Well, thank you all for attending. Ken, thanks for your nice intro. It turns out I'll be talking more about the World Bank and the IMF because I heard that Ben will talk about the IMF, and honestly, I know more about the World Bank, although I know a bit about the fund. Note that I will refer to both these institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, as international financial institutions. Actually, I'll call them IFIs. They're also known as the Bretton Woods institutions because they were founded in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, toward the end of World War II, basically, as you'll hear soon from me, to uphold the Western rules-based order. So my presentation is ordered around several interrelated themes as follows. I'll start with the two IFI's own stated missions. Then I'll discuss their real missions, what they do. I'll talk about their hegemonic governments led by the USA. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. Their leadership will be the next area of focus. Then what you've all heard of in the past or past program of theirs called structural adjustment loans and where they're at today. And then I'll talk about debt. And then I will say a few words about the IMF toward the end and close. So to start, let's begin with the IFI's own stated missions. The World Bank's stated twin mission goals, they always call them the twin mission goals, are to end extreme poverty and to boost shared prosperity in order to achieve a poverty-free world. I should explain that the World Bank group, it's a group, has 5 arms or facilities, and we won't go into all of them, although you're welcome to ask me questions about them. Today, we will concentrate on the International Development Association, which supports allegedly supports low-income countries, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is part of the World Bank group. It doesn't sound like it, but it is, and it makes loans to middle-income countries. And I'll mention 1 or 2 other World Bank arms in passing. I will present the International Monetary Fund's triple mission, which is to further international monetary cooperation, to encourage the expansion of trade and economic growth, and to discourage policies that would harm prosperity. The two IFI's real mission, reflected in their activities, is to sustain neocolonialism, In reality, colonialism has framed all bank and fund activities from inception to the present. As I already mentioned, the World War II winner countries created the bank and the fund to serve their colonial powers' capitalist model of development. So the IFI's de facto mission, in my view, is to uphold the West's rule-based order that we hear so much about these days in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, and in terms of China being the enemy who's trying to destroy the rules-based order, etc. So now I'm going to talk about examples of the US role as the hegemon in the Bretton Woods or in the international financial institutions. So here are examples. Both IFIs have in-house full-time boards of directors that meet on a day-to-day basis to set their policies and approve their loans. The US is the only country of 189 member countries of each of these two IFIs that has veto power on their boards of directors. You have to meet a 16% threshold of shares in order to have a veto, and the US is the only country in the world that has over 16% of shares. And unlike the UN's one country, one vote, the IFI vote is determined by the number of shares every country owns. In other words, you buy your votes. This is not a voluntary arrangement. For example, the US and Europe have refused to reduce their board shares over the years to permit the second largest global economy, China, to obtain shares commensurate with the size of its economy. China has wanted but been denied the opportunity to buy enough shares to approximate the US's veto power. The US and Europe also refused to reduce their shares so that the old colonies could have more voice. So to this day, on both the World Bank and the IMF boards, which each have 25 seats, so you can see not all of their 189 countries have their own seats, some of them share seats. There are only 3 seats on their boards for all 54 countries in Africa. So you can see there's a lot of lopsidedness. Of course, the US has its own privileged seat, and a few of the other colonial or neo-colonial powers also do so. It's not surprising that China established co-established two new international financial institutions in 2016, the Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and then together with the other BRICS countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, established the Shanghai-based New Development Bank. So these are the world's 2 newest IFIs that began operating in January 2016. And I think China sees them as an antidote to some extent to the World Bank and the IMF. China does remain active in the World Bank and the IMF, but it has much more power in these new institutions. And don't think of them as small. The AIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, based in Beijing, must have now 115 member countries. It's not only lending in Asia, as its name implies, it's making loans to Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. It's a global institution that is very young and is vying with the World Bank to have influence in developing countries. The role of the US Treasury is another example of the US hegemony in these institutions. The US Treasury is paramount. It's the most influential voice in the IFIs. Anybody who wants to influence the IFIs appeals to US Treasury officials. I mean, sometimes IFI watcher groups also reach out to Congress, notably the House Financial Services and the Senate Foreign Relations Committees, which authorize funds for the IFIs. But Treasury is where the decisions are made. Treasury appoints the US board members and sends marching orders to that US board member, which is the only board member who has veto power in making decisions. I'd now like to turn to recent leadership. Since the bank and the fund founded in 1944, with the under the neocolonial paradigm that reflected a huge power imbalance between rich, powerful countries and less fortunate borrower countries. They have maintained, that is, the founders have maintained what's called an unwritten gentleman's agreement. It should have a different gender, but that's what it's still called, whereby every World Bank president has been an American to date. And every IMF head, who is called the managing director, has been European. So far, every World Bank president has been an American male. The IMF's last two European heads have been female, however. Despite global South leaders throwing in their hat, sometimes to compete to fill these leadership positions, they have never been allowed to lead them, even though they are the people, their countries are most impacted by the World Bank and the IMF. So you might have heard about the very recent World Bank presidential turnover. Former World Bank president David Malpass stepped down a few weeks ago following protests by environmental organizations because he's a climate change denier. By the way, before becoming World Bank president, Malpass previously was U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary for International Finance, appointed by Republicans. And before that, he worked at Bear Stearns when it collapsed. The new World Bank president, Ajay Banga, he was born in India, but he's an American. He assumed power 10 days ago, on June the 2nd. Banga was rapidly nominated by the US government as soon as Malpass announced his resignation. I mean, no other country could vie to become president because the US announced his presidency. I mean, there was no chance of a competition this time. Nobody else tried even. So this continues the deeply neo-colonial, archaic gentleman's agreement whereby the US always gets to choose and head the World Bank, and Europe, the head of the IMF. We protested outside the bank on Banga's first day, 10 days ago, to no avail, of course. So Banga, the new president of the World Bank, comes straight from the empire's heart as former chief executive of MasterCard. Both Exor, the investment holding company, where Banga is still board chair, and Temasek, which is Singapore's state-owned investment or sovereign wealth fund, where Banga is a director, they both invest heavily in fossil fuel projects. I so much hope, Lisa, that you're going to talk about fossil fuel investments by these IFIs, by the World Bank in your country, because there's so much of it. So Banga, the new World Bank president, he cashed in on MasterCard share sales after a Trump-era tax cut that allowed MasterCard to inflate its share price through buybacks. A political story stated, quote, "Some of the biggest winners from President Trump's new tax law are corporate executives who have reaped gains as their companies buy back a record amount of stock, a practice that rewards shareholders by boosting the values of existing shares. MasterCard CEO Ajay Banga sold $45 million of stock in May, the largest single cash out by an executive of the company in at least 10 years, months after the company announced a $4 billion buyback of its own stock. Banga also has board seats on many global companies such as Citigroup, Dow, PepsiCo, and Nestle. So that's the new head of the World Bank. US President Biden praised Banga, quote, "for decades of experience building global companies and public-private partnerships," end quote, as valued credentials when announcing Banga's nomination. Banga's choice for World Bank leadership sends a clear message. The future of the public taxpayer-financed IFIs is private. And this message provides a perfect segue to my discussing structural adjustment next. So starting around 1980 and driven by Reagan and Thatcher's neoliberalism, the bank and the fund jointly launched structural adjustment loans. Structural adjustment means restructuring economies through requiring borrower countries to adopt tough austerity measures such as downsizing and privatizing public services, for example, education, healthcare, and water, making them unaffordable to the poor, as well as privatizing state-owned enterprises and streamlining, meaning laying off, public sector workers. Why would any developing country want IFI loans that require such onerous conditions? It's because these already highly indebted countries cannot resist structural adjustment loans' much faster disbursement rate of funds than conventional project investment loans. You know, conventional projects usually disperse over about 8 years. Structural adjustment loans, you can get the same amount of money in about a year and a half. It's very attractive to highly indebted countries. So indebted countries need liquidity, including to repay IFI loans, in the vicious circle of taking IFI loans to repay existing loans. To this day, this vicious debt circle dominates global South countries' relations with the IFIs and their hegemonic masters. Civil society groups continuously critique structural adjustment loans' harmful impacts. So to throw off our critiques, the World Bank renamed structural adjustment loans development policy loans, which they're still called today, and they replaced structural adjustment loans conditionalities with something called, quote, a priori actions, unquote, which actually are loan conditions that countries must meet before loan funds are dispersed. So structural adjustment loans disperse funds in tranches as countries met conditionalities gradually, but development policy loans have all the conditions met in advance, and then you get all the money right away. Very attractive to countries desperately needing to repay loans, needing liquidity for that reason. So the World Bank no longer even uses the word conditionality, but it actually practices having them. Investments in the energy sector, including in fossil fuels, are being implemented by the IFIs through, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned in passing public-private partnerships, which are actually really private. There's a lot of controversy coming up for this coming week's Paris summit for a new financing pact, which is supposed to green the world. And most of the financing for this climate transition would come from private sector sources. The World Bank is very involved in this model. Under a previous World Bank president, two removed, Kim Yong-kim, he announced that the World Bank was transforming its billions into trillions through private investments. In other words, he was leveraging the small public sector by subsidizing private capital that actually protects the private sector. For example, one of the World Bank Group arms called MIGA, which stands for Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, corporation, agency, I'm sorry, I wrote it out wrong. It makes global South borrower governments who borrow funds from the World Bank pay for any corporate losses, that is, any corporate partners' losses in these privatized schemes. It's just astonishing. In other words, poor countries, poor people's taxes have to pay back corporations for any losses they incur. So they never incur any losses because they're guaranteed by the World Bank's MIGA that they won't in this public-private partnership deal. So the IFIs have promoted a privatization mania since the advent of structural adjustment, which just keeps getting stronger and stronger. And, you know, continuously, this privatization of all kinds of important services like water, health, education, and housing just squeezes out poor people's ability to access these basic needs. So long as the IFI paradigm promotes privatization of public services in low and middle income countries, from infrastructure to energy to water to social services, the bank is not creating conditions to combat poverty, but is exacerbating poverty and class and gender inequalities. I'd like to say a few more words on debt. According to Oxfam, 40 out of 67 low-income countries and 20% of middle-income countries are now struggling to repay their debt. This means they are compelled to make impossible choices about basic necessities that sustain people's health and welfare, like for schools and food and more. But debt repayment to the bank and the fund, which eats up countries' budgets, is right up there at the top of their obligations. So progressive groups, partners of my organization, Gender Action, we work in coalitions, we are calling for an anti-colonial feminist, for a feminist decolonial, debt-free Green New Deal globally, in contrast to the IFI's approach that subsidizes private investors and increases debt and ensures continuous financial flows from the south to the north rather than the reverse. I would like to say a few words about the IMF, as I promised I would, and that's about the IMF's gatekeeper lane. Since founding to this day, the IMF has been the gatekeeper and the global monetary police that determines whether countries can access funds from bilateral aid agencies, from multilateral development banks, and even from commercial banks. None of these funding entities will lend a penny to developing countries if they are not in good standing with the IMF. Every couple of years, the IMF deeply assesses each member country's balance of payments. If a country is deemed to be too indebted, the IMF recommends strong austerity measures and raising taxes. I just realized my puppy is scratching and making a very loud noise. I hope it's not bothering you. To conclude, I'm going to conclude with two things that I've been saying all along. First, while IFIs claim that they are reducing poverty and inequality, their loan policy conditions and their public-private partnerships ensure the private corporate sector benefits while indebting poor countries' governments. Is that not colonial? Second, IFIs plunge global south countries into debt crises and extract wealth for the global capitalist class. And thank you. I'd be happy later.
Great. Thank you very much, Elaine. And now, Lisa Maza, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this webinar on the IMF World Bank as tools of the empire. This webinar is very, very timely for me and for us Filipinos, because yesterday was the commemoration of the 125th year of the Philippine independence, which is actually a sham independence. And let me give you some history on this, because this is very much connected to our discussion, to our topic this morning. So this independence was a sham independence because when the Filipinos declared independence from Spain in 1898 and proclaimed a republic, the US stole the victory of the Philippine Revolution. The US refused to recognize the Philippine Republic, and they waged a war of colonization against the Philippines from 1899 to 1902 that killed almost 1 million Filipinos. Some historians call the Philippines the first Vietnam because of this. The Philippines became a colony of the United States, and although we were formally granted independence in 1946, the Philippines is still a neo-colony of the US through the use of, among others, tools such as the IMF World Bank in order to tighten imperialist control on our country. I will discuss two areas where the IMF World Bank were used by the US to exercise control over the Philippines. First is the shaping of Philippine economy, and second is control of Philippine politics and governance. And may I request that the slides, yes, thank you. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Okay. The first slide, please. Okay, next, please. Next, okay. The World Bank engagement in the Philippines started in the late 1950s through incremental loans. When Marcos Sr. declared martial law in 1972, the US, the World Bank, and the IMF supported the dictator. The World Bank increased by more than 5 times the amount of money loaned to the Philippines in 1974. The then World Bank President, Robert McNamara, viewed the Philippines as an important US ally because because of the context then, which was the height of the Vietnam War, and the Philippines hosting of 2 of the largest US bases outside of the US territory that were used as springboards for the Vietnam War. The Marcos dictatorship assured payment of the loans by quickly enacting an automatic appropriations law, which is said to be the only legislation in the world that prioritizes debt payments over any other expenditures, like those for health, education, housing, and other social services. In 1980, the Marcos dictatorship made the Philippines the first country in Asia and the second to Turkey in the world as the recipient of the structural adjustment loan. The martial law regime started to implement the market-oriented or neoliberal economic framework that shaped our economy under the direction and support of US imperialist-led IMF World Bank. Controls like lowering of tariffs were implemented. Peso was devalued. Import substitution industrialization was changed to export-oriented industrialization, which actually never industrialized our country. Among the first presidential order of Marcos was to set up the export processing zone in the Philippines. Well, the export processing zones actually became a haven for multinational corporations who wanted to do business in the Philippines because of the tax incentives and all the other, privileges that the government gives to multinational corporations doing manufacturing in the Philippines. The succeeding regimes after Marcos continued the opening of our economy for the plunder by the United States and other foreign interests. Our country became export-oriented, import-dependent, and debt-driven. Next slide, please. Oh, wait. Okay. Can we go back? Can we go back to that slide? As you can see here, when we implemented the structural adjustment loans, we can see that from 1965 to 2010, our production fell from 62% to 47%. The manufacturing fell from 28% to 23%, and agriculture fell from 24% to 17%. So this structural adjustment program did not actually develop our real economy, which is composed of the manufacturing and the agricultural sectors. Next, please. Next. Yes. So here, you can see the external debt of the Philippines since 1965. And we note that from the different administrations, that ruled the Philippines, they all were, having this policy of borrowing from the IMF, World Bank, and other international financial institutions, such that our external debt grew by leaps and bounds. And we can also see that, next please. In the next slide, next please. Yeah, here in the next slide, we can see that during the martial law era, and this is 1975 to to early 1980s, the rate of increase of our loan is really very high, no? Like from 1 year to the next year, the Marcos dictatorship would increase its loan by as much as 40 to 50, as much as like 35 to 40% increase, no, from the previous year. So this is really very high. In the era of imperialist globalization, the policies of the regulation, liberalization, and privatization, policies that were imposed by the IMF World Bank, further worsened poverty and inequality in our country by destroying our agriculture and industry. Our social services sector, like health, education, and housing, and public utilities like water and electricity that should be common goods were privatized for corporate profit. Government assets were sold. And in the sale of government assets, pockets of corrupt government officials were lined, with a part of the sale of these government assets. So these globalization policies really burdened the poor. Next slide, please. For example, when the water was privatized in 1997, the net income in 10 years of private water companies, and there were 2 private water companies in the Philippines, the Manila Water and Maynilad, and they increased their profit by 137% and 444% respectively. Whereas water rates for consumers, water rates for customers of Manila Water increased by 879%, while Maynilad customers increased by 574%. So water, which previously was of low cost, now became, very, very expensive, especially for the poor Filipinos. Next, please. In relation to liberalization, the Philippines, which was a rice producer, became the second rice importer next to China in 2019. So we were not really producing rice anymore. No, we are just importing rice. No? And the fact that the Philippines is an agricultural country, and we have the International Rice Research Institution, which is supposed to be developing, the rice industry, but until now we are not rice self-sufficient because of we were not developing our agriculture, and when we entered the WTO, we were compelled, to import rice, and to reduce the tariff on rice. Next, please. In relation to the oil deregulation, the oil deregulation was legislation that really served the oil companies. When the oil industry was deregulated, the prices of oil continued to rise, and the increases have become more frequent under this deregulation regime that burdened consumers with high and unwarranted prices. During the 15 years prior to oil industry deregulation, the overall price of petroleum products increased by only about 8.6% every year. But after the regulation, the yearly increase almost doubled at 16%, from 1996 to 2010. So we also found out that local oil price increases have also been observed to be higher compared to global price hikes and rollbacks lower than global price decreases, indicating overpricing by oil companies. In spite of the fact that we should have developed our malampaya, no? Because there are areas of the Philippine seas, no, where it is said that there is gas and oil reserves, and we should have developed that. But we are not doing that. We are importing oil, and we are, actually allowing private corporations to exploit our oil potential. Next, please. Well, today, the Philippines is mired in debt. Our external debt is at record high of $111.3 billion, which is 27.5% of our GDP. And the government spends about 30% of our income for debt servicing, which is higher than the budget for education and health combined. Debt servicing, even for onerous debts and those ridden with corruption, is given priority over budget for social services. In relation to how these imperialist tools impact our politics and governance, it is very clear from our experience that the debt serves as milking cow for our corrupt government officials. During martial law, the Marcos regime implemented the neoliberal policies as prescribed by the US, led by IMF World Bank, in exchange for a share in the foreign loans and business opportunities for the Marcos family and their cronies. The loans fostered corruption and cronyism. Our experience under martial law and the succeeding regimes after also showed us that repressive measures, authoritarian rule, and fascist dictatorship were necessary for the status quo to implement these neoliberal policies and austerity measures that burden the poor. As a last point, let me say that in today's increasingly multipolar world, the US, now threatened by the rise of China as a world power, has heightened its warmongering, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. The Biden administration has cozied up with President Bongbong Marcos Jr., son of the late dictator, promising support and assistance to his regime in exchange for the setting up of US military facilities in our soil to be used as launching pad for the US-led war against China. It is expected that, like development aid, which is now increasingly linked to imperialist security and defense, loans will be likewise blatantly used with conditionalities to advance not only US imperialist economic interests, but political and military interests as well. The Philippine experience more or less mirrors the debt crisis being experienced now by countries like Sri Lanka, Argentina, and Egypt. This crisis heightened our resistance against imperialism, fascism, and all reaction. And our struggle persists to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So wonderful to have you here from the other side of the world. Appreciate what you had to say. And now our third speaker is Ben Norton. And take it away, Ben.
Great. Can you all hear me?
Yep. Yes.
It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me. I think it's very important to understand the Bretton Woods institutions, that is largely the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in the context of colonialism. And we should never forget that when the Bretton Woods Conference was held in 1944, much of the world was still colonized. So these institutions are not only neo-colonial, they're colonial because they were created at a time in which, yes, the British Empire was collapsing at the end of World War II, but the British Empire still controlled a massive part of the world's territory. The French Empire and, of course, the US Empire has continued. So they have their origins in European colonialism toward the end of the European empires in World War II, going into the era of neocolonialism and decolonization in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And functionally today, they play a very similar role as kind of neo-colonial institutions. Now, it wasn't inevitable that this was going to happen. And I think it's important to study the history of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and the different proposals that had been presented. John Maynard Keynes, who is not a socialist. I mean, now it's funny is, economics has moved so far to the right, especially with the rise of neoliberalism, that among some circles, Keynes is seen as a radical. But I mean, in his era, he was absolutely not a radical. He was really a centrist among different economists. Maybe you could say center left. And Keynes's vision for creating international financial institutions was quite different from the US proposals proposed by Harry Dexter White, who was the more conservative economist that was representing the United States. Keynes had envisioned, yes, the creation of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, but specifically with an international clearing union, with an international reserve currency, not the US dollar, and very strict capital controls and control of monetary policy. And all of the major currencies and commodities would be pegged to, or rather the international currency, reserve currency would be pegged to the international currencies and commodity prices in order to make sure that there was genuinely a more equitable framework for countries around the world to trade. What actually happened instead of that, I mean, again, despite legitimate criticisms of Keynes and his limitations, what actually happened is the US won the debate to create these Bretton Woods institutions, and essentially they became instruments of US geopolitical and economic control. Now, one of the main things that Washington was interested in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference was making sure that there were no mechanisms that would make sure more even balance of payments around the world. Because at the end of World War II in 1944, 1945, the US economy represented around 1/2 of global GDP. And the US wanted to make sure that its position as the leading exporter, especially as it reindustrialized Europe and prevented Europe from going socialist through the Marshall Plan, which was not done for benevolent reasons. It was to prevent Europe from going socialist and maintain a captive market for US goods, which had all this production that it increased during the war. So one of the ways that the US planned on doing that was making sure there were not mechanisms that prevented surplus countries from having too much surplus and trapping relatively poor countries in chronic deficits. That was exactly opposed to what Keynes had proposed. Keynes's idea with the International Clearing Union was that countries that had significant surpluses would build up a big account of what the bond core, which is the international reserve currency he proposed instead of using the dollar. And if surplus countries had too many reserves of the bond core in their account, it would be transferred to the International Clearing Union. So countries would be incentivized to not build up too big of a surplus. And that would also help countries, relatively poor countries that are reliant on a lot of imports that have deficits, to balance their trade. Instead of that, which would have, again, it's not a perfect system, but it would have made international trade more equitable and prevented potentially this pattern we've seen for decades in which surplus countries like the United States, like Germany, like Japan, continue to export and export and export, while many countries in the global south cannot develop significant industry because they're facing all this competition and because the policies of the United States and Western powers have intentionally deindustrialized countries in the global south, preventing them from developing their own industries, preventing them from using protectionist policies to create those industries, which is what would be necessary, which is exactly what the Western powers did, as the economist Ha-Joon Chang has shown in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder. So it was about the Bretton Woods systems were about keeping this colonial framework of the world in which the imperial surplus countries would continue to export their excess capital, the surplus value produced by their workers, and countries in the global south would not really have any alternatives. Now, that did change in the 70s, which I'll get to in a second, but I just wanted to highlight that. The other key element to take away, it looks like my video froze here. That's weird. Let me try again. There we go. The other key element to take away of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 is it established the US dollar specifically as the global reserve currency, which even infuriated some of the other Western colonial powers. So for instance, by the 1960s, France's government, which of course is a still colonial government committing atrocities in Algeria, France's government was complaining of the exorbitant privilege of the United States with its dollar, it's the currency being the global reserve currency. And French President Charles de Gaulle was constantly exchanging US dollars for gold. And as the economist Michael Hudson has shown in his book, Super Imperialism, the US was essentially printing more and more money to pay for the balance of payments deficits that had built up because of payment for war. So the US had been a major surplus country, was a major industrial producer exporting around the world. But in 1950, the US starts this war on Korea that kills 3 million Koreans, that destroys 80% of the buildings in the northern part of Korea, that was responsible for killing 20% of the Korean population. And in order to pay for that war, the US essentially printed more money, and essentially the dollars pegged to gold became less and less, real and more fictitious. And then, of course, there was the Vietnam War. And by 1971, Richard Nixon ends the convertibility of the dollar into gold, which had been set at a fixed price back in the Bretton Woods Conference of $35 per troy ounce of gold. That ends and the dollar becomes freely floating. And then we enter Bretton Woods 2, the era that we're kind of coming out of now when people talk about Bretton Woods 3. So the reason I talk about that history, it's not necessarily important to know all of the details, but the two main points to take away are that the international financial system created at the end of World War II was created, one, to benefit the United States with its currency as the global reserve currency, and two, to maintain a certain balance of payments pattern in the world in which the colonial powers with chronic surpluses can keep those chronic surpluses, and countries in the global south are trapped in deficits. That's important because it partially explains why there is such a long history of so many countries in the global south being trapped in debt that is unpayable. It is unpayable. It has to be forgiven if these countries truly want to develop economically. But of course, the goal is not to make them develop economically. It's to keep them dependent on the surplus producing countries. Although, again, this changes with Bretton Woods too, and especially as the US becomes more and more of a deficit country. And this is the era that really helps us understand today and the role of the IMF and the World Bank. So when the dollar gets delinked from gold, the US government makes an agreement with Saudi Arabia to create the petrodollar system. So in 1971, Richard Nixon ends the convertibility of the dollar into gold unilaterally, despite the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency. And in 73, there is the OPEC oil lockout, and this leads to a massive increase in the price of oil in the global market. And the Nixon administration in 1974 sends its Treasury Secretary to Saudi Arabia to sign an agreement in which Saudi Arabia will sell its oil in dollars in return for protection from the United States. And this is the second historic agreement after 1945, in which US President FDR famously meets on Valentine's Day, his final Valentine's Day, with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Ibn Saud, and they agree that the US will provide military support for Saudi Arabia in return for economic relations. Well, in 1974, it specifically establishes the petrodollar system, which maintains international demand for the US dollar because it's no longer as good as gold. And clearly the United States has, the dollar is very overvalued given how much it has printed compared to the actual gold in its reserves. So the petrodollar system maintains international demand for the dollar because countries that need to import oil have to get access to dollars to pay for that oil. And of course, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest oil producer, the de facto leader of OPEC, and still today it has a very commanding role in global oil production, consistently among the top three, along with the United States and Russia, although that system is changing quite rapidly, which I'll conclude talking about here. So getting back to Bretton Woods too. Now, this helps us to understand the third world debt crisis in the 1980s. And I would argue that we're in a moment that is quite similar to the third world debt crisis in the 1980s today, although there are some significant differences, which I'll delineate. So what happens is Saudi Arabia now has all of these dollars because it's selling its oil in dollars. And what does it do with those dollars? It recycles those dollars back in US commercial banks. This is petrodollar recycling. And of course, this is a boon to the US economy. And what do the commercial banks in the United States do with all of those dollars? They lend those dollars at low interest rates, especially to countries in the global south. So this is the golden era of Keynesianism, still leading toward neoliberalism. It's the golden era of import substitution industrialization. And Latin America is an example of this. You had countries, you had governments in Argentina and Mexico and Brazil that had not socialist governments, but nationalist-oriented governments that were serious about industrialization and development of their economies through a system of import substitution industrialization. And they take these large loans at low interest rates from US banks, and they're using it to fund infrastructure projects and industrial development. And what happens? We have the rise of an infamous figure who should, in my opinion, be as well known as Milton Friedman. Maybe he wasn't as influential in the discourse around promoting, right-wing neoliberal libertarian economics, but in terms of his impact on US policy, he was one of the most influential figures in the 20th century in US politics. That is Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was basically, with Friedman, one of the architects of neoliberalism. He was an economist who, from the 1950s, was pushing the idea of monetarism of Milton Friedman, that all inflation everywhere and always is caused by, it's a monetary phenomenon caused by too much money chasing too few goods, which is obviously a much more simplistic explanation that doesn't explain the reality. But Paul Volcker, he went in and out of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and he also worked at Chase Bank, which is important because Professor Michael Hudson, who also previously had worked at Chase, said that Paul Volcker was such an ardent neoliberal, even before neoliberalism was a coherent ideology. He was such an right-wing kind of libertarian economist that he walked around in meetings, and in his pocket on his shirt, he had the data for wages in the United States. And he consistently argued that wages were too high. And his goal was to drop wages in the United States, ostensibly to bring down inflation. And it's no coincidence that in the 1970s, especially with many of Paul Volcker's policies under first in the Treasury under Nixon, and then in the central bank, the Federal Reserve under Carter, and then of course under Ronald Reagan, he made sure that wages stagnated ever since the 1970s. That was around 1976, depending on the data you look at, 76, 78 was peak for wages in the United States. When Paul Volcker comes in 1979 as the chair of the Federal Reserve, it is a sledgehammer, and this is the infamous Volcker shock. And we're living in something similar today, although not nearly as dramatic. He drastically raises the federal funds rate, that is interest rates of the Federal Reserve, and this causes a recession. And this is in order to bring down the inflation ostensibly in the United States, although in reality, as I said, it's to crush unions and break the back of labor and drop wages in the United States. And the labor movement has never recovered from Paul Volcker. And again, I should point out that he was in Nixon's Treasury Department. And in fact, Paul Volcker was involved in the Nixon shock, the idea to end the convertibility of the dollar into gold. But he was also appointed by Carter in 1979 by Jimmy Carter as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And then, of course, he continued on under Reagan. And ironically, Ron Paul, the right-wing libertarian, he has nothing good to say about the Fed. In fact, his slogan as a politician is quite literally "end the Fed." But if you look at what he said about Paul Volcker, he actually praised Paul Volcker as one of the few Federal Reserve chairmen that he actually admired. Anyway, so Paul Volcker's shock, drastically raising interest rates, smashes the labor movement in the United States. And also it leads to the third world debt crisis, because what happens, the low interest rate loans that many of these global South countries had taken from US banks suddenly become, one, depending on whether or not it was negotiable, some of the interest rates go up, or simply the dollar becomes significantly overvalued and it significantly appreciates in relation to other currencies, especially in the global south. And what that means is that as interest rates go up, it encourages investors to, capital flights. I mean, although at this time there was more capital control, but they invest more back in assets in the United States and treasury bonds because they're higher interest bearing, right? I think even at this moment there was like 20% short-term interest bonds, 20% interest on short-term treasuries around this time. I mean, just really high returns. So what that also does is it means that countries in the global south who have their currencies depreciate against the US dollar, it makes it very expensive for them to pay off that debt that they had with these US commercial banks. And here comes in the World Bank and especially the International Monetary Fund, which before then, I mean, it was an influential institution, but it wasn't as influential as it became. And this is of course, the era of neoliberalism on the rise, with Ronald Reagan in the US, Margaret Thatcher in Britain. And here we have the structural adjustments that come in, the Washington consensus policies, and the imposition of political policies on countries in the global south that have to privatize state-owned enterprises and state assets. They have to deregulate their markets, lift capital controls. They have to cut wages. They have to break the back of unions and cut workers' protections. All of the right-wing neoliberal economic policies that we know of today. The reason I went to that history is because that explains how we got to the moment where the International Monetary Fund in particular came in as an institution that had been originally created in order to deal with balance of payments problems, largely. And I would highly recommend, I mean, we should keep in mind that when we're talking about this, it's not just a matter of economics and ideology, it's a matter of criminality. And this is shown very well in John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, because as always, we can talk about the policy of the United States above the table, right? Its political foreign policy and its economic policies. But below the table, there's also a lot of chicanery and dirty tricks going on, support for coups, of course, Chile in 1973, also simply blackmail and corruption and bribery. And John Perkins spells that out very well. He was a consultant for the World Bank, and how these are essentially colonial tools that trap countries in unpayable debt and essentially siphon out their wealth and drain that wealth toward the global north countries. Now, so that explains Bretton Woods 1, Bretton Woods 2. Now, concluding here, I want to briefly highlight some of the changes we're seeing today, because we are seeing significant changes. And one of the main reasons for that is the 2008 financial crash. Although the other significant reason, just as historic, actually more historic, is the rise of China, which, according to purchasing power parity, now has a larger, purchasing power parity is a much better measurement of GDP because it measures the purchasing power of a currency rather than the nominal figure, which just measures, it takes the size of the US, the Chinese economy in renminbi, the Chinese currency, and then just converts everything to dollars, which doesn't make sense because if you're a Chinese person paid in yuan, you're not going to use dollars to buy, bread and things. So purchasing power parity is a more accurate measurement. And according to a PPP measurement, for 5 years now, China's economy has been larger than that of the US and continues to grow at around 5% per year, whereas the US economy is largely stagnant. So even in nominal terms, China is very soon going to overtake the United States as the world's largest economy nominally. It already has been. And by the way, if you look at IMF data, the most recent data from April, the United States now represents around 15% of global GDP, PPP. That's around 15% of the global economy. Compare that to around half of the global economy at the end of World War II. So we're talking about a world historic shift in economic power. Anyway, the point is that the other factor I mentioned, the 2008 financial crash, was a wake-up call for many countries. And even the Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, said that we need to rethink the international financial institutions, international, scare quotes, which really are dominated by the United States. And specifically, the governor of the People's Bank of China floated the idea of returning to to John Maynard Keynes' idea of the bond core, of an international reserve currency that is not the dollar, that does not give the United States the exorbitant privilege of being able to maintain a constant deficit with the rest of the world and constantly import the surplus value produced by workers around the world and not face chronic inflation like countries like Argentina would face right now. So the People's Bank of China began proposing this idea of creating new financial institutions. This leads to China creating its own development banks and the BRICS system of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, creating the BRICS Bank, now known as the New Development Bank. These are all very important because it shows the opening salvos of Bretton Woods 3, or you could say post-Bretton Woods, which might be a better term, and the new international financial order that provides new financial alternatives for countries in the global south that have chronically been trapped in debt, and this system in which they can't develop the industry they need and implement the development policies like import substitution, industrialization policies they need in order to get over their chronic deficits. Because in order to stop having a chronic deficit, you have to be able to develop your own local industry because you're relying on importing commodities if you don't have oil and gas, fertilizers if you don't have that, and wheat. Many countries in the global south are dependent on, countries like Sri Lanka, or also importing capital goods and technologies that you can't produce, right? So what we're now seeing is the creation of these new institutions, and they're growing very rapidly, and they're de-dollarizing, which is a massive blow to this system that I talked about, in which the US dollar maintains this kind of imperial control over these global international institutions that are, essentially dominated by the United States. In the case of the World Bank, the US by far is the largest shareholder with around 16%. And if you go to the World Bank website, they boast openly that every single World Bank president has been appointed by the United States and has been a US citizen. So now we see, for instance, today is June 12th. And this week, the left-wing president of Honduras, Samara Castro, is in China. She just took a trip to the New Development Bank in Shanghai. Brazil's left-wing president, Lula da Silva, also just visited the New Development Bank in April and gave a speech calling for de-dollarization and the creation of a new global reserve currency. And the BRICS is discussing creating a global reserve currency. It was discussed this June in a meeting of the BRICS foreign ministers in South Africa. And it's potentially going to be based on the idea of Keynes's concept of the bond core. That is, it's going to be based potentially on a basket of different currencies of members of the BRICS and potentially commodities, instead of giving one country the exorbitant privilege the United States has had. So Uruguay is in the process of joining the New Development Bank. Bangladesh, the UAE, and Egypt are already members. We've seen that Argentina and Saudi Arabia and Kazakhstan have been approved, and Zimbabwe have been approved to join. And of course, over 20 countries have applied or expressed interest in joining the BRICS system. So we're seeing a completely new international financial framework, and time will tell where that leads. But I think it's a very interesting moment in which finally countries that have been trapped in this pattern of being having to take loans from the IMF. Sri Lanka right now is going through its 17th IMF structural adjustment program, 17 since the 1950s. And it's similar for many other countries, Argentina, etc. So these countries that have been trapped in these neoliberal structural adjustment policies are now being able to pursue new paths of economic development, which, they don't have the same political conditionalities imposed on them by other institutions like the New Development Bank. So it's still quite early in the stages of the development of what some economists like Sultan Posa are referring to as Bretton Woods 3 and a multipolar global currency system, a multipolar currency system. We can talk more about that potentially later, but I think it's a very interesting and exciting moment, and it provides a lot of possibilities for the world. So I'm sorry, I think I probably spoke well over my time, but thank you for letting me talk about these, and thank you for the other great contributions today.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. You got a lot in there in your time, I'll tell you. So brilliant. I appreciate you a lot. So we're going long. We had 3 speakers, which is longer than we usually have. Normally we have 2 speakers. And why don't we give ourselves another 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A? And the way we do it here is if you would go to the reactions button, you can see Beth up there already has her hand raised. If you go to the reaction button, you can raise your hand there. You can choose to raise your hand. And what we do is take you in order as these hands are raised. So we may only have time for 3 or 4 questions because I say we're going long here. Please do ask a question. Keep your comments short if you have comments, and have a question for our presenters. And so Beth, go ahead. You'll be the first person.
Hi, this has been very informational. I'm very curious about if there's any kind of movement, either a people's movement or a socialist movement, that to counteract all the harmful developments that have come about as of the IMF and the World Bank that you all discussed about. I hope you understand. I'm sorry, I'm hoarse from a cold, but do you know what I'm asking about? I want to know if there's more of a people's movement / socialist movement to counteract the harmfulness of the system that has been so propagated over the last 60 or so years. Thank you. And tell me if I didn't make that clear.
Thank you, Beth. Can any or some of you answer that question or respond to it at least?
I'll just say one thing. Oh, I see Lisa's also raising her hand.
It's okay. Please go ahead.
Just one sentence. There is the Progressive International, Bernie Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis and 100 other, kind of left of center social democrats have established and are increasingly strengthening, but others may have other thoughts. Lisa?
Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I would just like also to say that in the Philippines, there are a lot of organizations that are, that are working against these imperialist impositions. There are a lot, especially of grassroots organizations of workers, peasants, urban poor, women, youth, that are coming together, denouncing, protesting, and resisting imperialism and the government's puppetry to imperialist powers and to IMF World Bank. There are various forms of struggle being waged in my country, from parliamentary, like there are progressive party list organizations that are very much questioning the neoliberal policies, in Congress, for example. I became actually a member of the cabinet during Duterte's time, as head of the National Anti-Poverty Commission. And for the first time in the history of the Philippine, Philippine government, someone was able to, propose very clearly that the Philippines should get out from this neoliberal framework. But of course, we know that that could not be so, because the government is very much a puppet of the US. But as I've said, there are a lot of forms that the Filipinos have undertaken to advance our democratic interest and also our anti-imperialist interest. From parliamentary forms to the armed revolution by waging the National Liberation Movement. So internationally, my organization, the International League of People's Struggles, is a democratic and anti-imperialist formation with about 300 mainly grassroots organizations under our umbrella. And we are a democratic and anti-imperialist movement, and it is we are developing our organization as a platform for grassroots people's action and advocacy for democratic and anti-imperialist struggle. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll briefly jump in. Everywhere you look, across the global south, there are forces, political movements, political parties, even governments trying to create alternatives to the Western-dominated financial system, especially the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, the BRICS I talked about, but oftentimes I think when we talk about, the rise of an increasingly multipolar world, we often forget the other institutions. It's not simply just the US and China and Russia, right? It's also within Latin America, for instance. There are many attempts at creating regional financial institutions and even a currency. So when Hugo Chavez was president of Venezuela and the first wave of the left-wing governments in the first decade of the 2000s, there was the creation of the Banco del Sur, the Bank of the South, which was created specifically as a World Bank alternative for Latin America by Latin American governments. And there are attempts now to revive that now that Lula is back in Brazil. And there's even discussions of creating a Banco Central del Sur, which is the central bank of the South, in order to oversee the creation of a regional currency for international trade, which is going to be tentatively called the Sur. And now Lula is making this a significant priority. And by the way, in August, there will be presidential elections in Ecuador, and it's likely the left wing is going to win if it's a free and fair election. And the vice presidential candidate, Andrés Arauz, is an economist who has been involved in the proposals to create a new currency and a central bank and other financial institutions for Latin America. So when we talk about regional integration with institutions like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, and the UNASUR, Union of South American Nations, there's also financial institutions and there are trade institutions like Mercosur, which is the southern market bloc. And this is true for other countries. So for instance, Southeast Asia through ASEAN, which doesn't have the same, kind of socialist orientation of many of the financial institutions and political institutions as part of the project of Latin American integration, which were created by leftists. But even in the case of ASEAN, we have seen the emergence of new financial institutions, and in particular for trade and for the use of local currencies. And there have been recent, very important historic discussions in which ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors have agreed to create mechanisms for regional trade using their own currencies. And even Indonesia, one of the most populous countries on earth with a growing economy, the Indonesian government has called for regional trade in other currencies, not in the US dollar. So everywhere you look, there are countries trying to find alternatives, and not only because of the history of being trapped in debt, in dollar-denominated debt owed to these US-dominated financial institutions, but also because simply right now, the US dollar is overvalued. And I mentioned that Paul Volcker, in the Volcker shock from 79 through the early 1980s, massively raised interest rates, leading to an overvalued dollar, which made it hard for countries in the global south to, one, service their debt, and two, pay for imports. Well, we're seeing something very similar today. And Jerome Powell, who is the current chair of the Federal Reserve, sees Paul Volcker as his role model. And he's been aggressively raising the Fed funds rate, the interest rate at the Fed. And that has significantly depreciated the value of currencies in the global south, once again, making it difficult for these countries to pay for imports and to service their dollar-denominated debt, which is another factor in why so many countries are seeking alternatives.
Good answers. I'm seeing 9:23, and why don't we try one or two more questions? We're not going to get everybody's questions, I'm afraid. Bernie Holland, go ahead.
Okay. Ben, I've been following your geopolitics now, very closely following this situation with CELAC, UNASUR, Banco de la Sur in the south. You've more or less answered the question I was going to ask, all right? But I want to put it to you. Are you aware of what's going on with Southcom in Latin America? Would you like to just amplify that for us? The activities of Southcom?
Yeah, should I answer, or are we going to? I'll briefly answer then. We'll keep it brief.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, Southcom, Southern Command, is the part of the U.S. military that oversees operations south of Mexico. And of course, the United States has, the US military has different commands, Central Command overseas operations in West Asia, African Command, AFRICOM in Africa. And the current commander of US Southcom, Lara Richardson, has made a lot of provocative comments, and not just one time, repeatedly, about the importance of controlling Latin America's natural resources. Pretty much every time Lara Richardson's interviewed, she did an interview last year with the Atlantic Council, and since then, every time she's interviewed, she talks about the importance of controlling the lithium in South America, especially the lithium triangle, which consists of Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina, and also Peru, depending on where you draw it. These are countries with large lithium reserves. Bolivia itself has the world's largest known lithium reserves, and together they represent more than half of global lithium production. And of course, lithium is extremely important as we move toward renewable energies. Lithium is necessary for the cameras that we're using, for our phones, for our computers, for the batteries, for electric cars. And after the 2019 US-backed coup that overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales, the current, owner of Twitter, billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, a welfare king who's received billions of dollars in subsidies from the US government while criticizing government, intervention in the economy. Elon Musk tweeted in response to someone criticizing him after the coup in Bolivia, the world's largest lithium producer. He said, "We will coup whoever we want." So that's very noteworthy. In fact, Lara Richardson, the commander of Southcom, revealed in this interview last year with the Atlantic Council that she has held phone calls with representatives of Albemarle, which is this company that is involved in mineral extraction, right? I mean, in lithium in particular. So she's having, as the head of US military operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, she's overseeing discussions about lithium mining in Latin America, which is, of course, should raise many red flags, the bad kind of red flags. And in every time she mentions this, she also talks about the oil reserves in countries like Venezuela and Colombia, the mineral reserves. Peru is the second biggest producer of copper, where the US backed a coup in December. Chile is the world's biggest producer of copper, and Goldman Sachs referred to copper last year as the new gold. And so there's going to be a new copper rush as we move toward renewable energy. So these are all very concerning things, considering how Southcom still has significant influence over Latin America. Colombia has multiple US military bases still. Honduras, which also has a left-wing government now, has the largest military base, Sotocano, in Latin America. And Southcom is always a sword of Damocles hanging over any left-wing government in the region.
Good. Let's do this. We have three people with their hands raised. Why don't we go 1, 2, 3, each of you ask your question, and then we'll hold the answers until we get all three questions out. And we'll have Ben, Lisa, and Elaine respond to the three questions all together as they pick and choose. So Yuri, let's go for you first.
Okay, thank you. One moment, let me just get my question out. Yeah, I just wanted to. I thought it was very interesting, Ben, talking about Paul Volcker. And because during the banking housing meltdown, he was rebranded as a voice of reason to rein in the big banks with the Volcker rule. Can Ben talk about this, and what do the panel think of BRICS, which isn't an alternative to capitalism, but what are some of the promising signs of it that the working class left should take advantage of, and any thoughts on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency as a alternative to the IMF and whatnot? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yuri. And Barbara Harrison.
My question, the US is in decline, as is the Western European countries. How long before BRICS takes over and becomes the dominant group of countries in the world? And their approach is quite different than especially the US. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. And Elizabeth Ecker.
Yeah, what would happen if the American dollar is not the reserve
currency anymore, how would it affect the borrowing of money for the Americans? With a debt ceiling, will it not be very difficult for them to borrow money if the dollar isn't the reserve currency anymore?
Okay. All right, thank you, all. And who wants to go first? Elaine, Liza, Ben. Hopefully you can remember the questions.
I remember them, that I can't answer them. I mean, the only one I even would know anything about whatsoever is when the BRICS would become dominant, or, you know, when the US and Europe continue to slide so much that they become dominant, or other developing countries become, or let's call them almost developed countries. The BRICS countries are all almost developed countries. I mean, they are pretty much so. I mean, it's impossible to say when, but we do know that the renminbi, which was not convertible a few years ago, is now being used by several countries, and an increasing number of countries will be using it. Even Lula in Brazil said, well, when he visited China a few weeks ago, he talked to Xi about starting to trade now in renminbi rather than in US dollars. And there are several other countries, Malaysia and some others, that have been doing that for some time already. And I think that's taking off more and more. I'm not saying that the renminbi will replace the US dollar. I don't know whether one or more than one currency will do so, but we do see a trend in countries starting for the first time to use other currencies for trade. And the US dollar will not always be the dominant currency, and it will not be the only convertible currency. Of course, the euro has been convertible, and the Japanese yen, and so on. But outside of these old colonial powers, other currencies like the renminbi are taking hold now. When, I can't say. They will become more dominant.
I would also like to respond. Yeah, well, I think that the opening up and the big challenge that is being put forward by BRICS countries is a very good opportunity for small countries to consolidate and maximize this opportunity to advance their perspective on what the new international order should be. You know? What financial architecture should be set up, how trading, you know, should be done, you know, that will not be disadvantageous, especially for small countries and poor countries. But one thing I think is important also, based on our experience, is the content of the alternatives that, for example, BRICS and China as a rising power is putting forward. You know? Like, for example, I take note the RCEP, you know, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Asian Partnership, which is still framed in the neoliberal economic paradigm. No? So, but then again, I hope, you know, that this situation where RCEP is trying to challenge, you know, US dominance and all the other alternative, you know, blocks could be maximized and could open to different perspectives, no? Not the dominant perspective of neoliberalism and all this that we have already, you know, that we are that we have found out that these are bankrupt policies, no? we should get out from this neoliberal framework. We should be able to set up a real, true, economic framework that will really develop people from the perspective of human rights, from the perspective of collective development of our peoples, etc. So this is my view. This is my aspiration from the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I'll
Ken.
take a stab at those questions. In terms of the BRICS, of course, the BRICS economies continue to grow, especially China, which represents over half of the GDP of the BRICS. It's actually about 2/3. And but India's economy is growing, although its industrial base is not significantly growing. And you can, there's people, it's funny, is Western media outlets love to question China's GDP figures, but they never question India's GDP figures, especially considering a lot of so-called development in India, which is still under a neoliberal model, involves displacing farmers who are subsistence farmers off of their land and pushing them into shanty towns, slums in urban areas. And then they maybe have a wage, a low wage, some kind of job, or they're in the informal economy. But because they have some kind of wage, technically you could argue GDP goes up because they weren't producing GDP in scare quotes when they were a subsistence farmer. So anyway, the point is that obviously GDP is not a great measurement, and it not to mention it doesn't include inequality. It doesn't include the quality of economic growth. But the point is anyway that the BRICS countries as a bloc now represent a larger share of the global economy when GDP is measured by PPP than the G7 does. That is a massive world historic shift, and that's largely because of China's economic growth. So as the BRICS countries grow and as Western economies are in decline, and especially as European economies are in decline, partially out of their own doing now with these suicidal policies of destroying their energy base. And obviously we have to transition away from fossil fuels, and I deeply support that, but doing it immediately by cutting off all oil and gas imports from your largest supplier basically overnight, at least in a few months, as the European Union has tried to do, is going to lead to significant deindustrialization of Germany. We're already seeing it. And ironically, the US government, through its own policies, especially the Inflation Reduction Act, which, I mean, it's good that it encourages some green industry, but what's not mentioned is that by subsidizing green industry, it's actually encouraging many European companies, which are simply unable to operate now because of the insanely expensive energy costs in countries like Europe and countries like Germany, are moving across the Atlantic over to the United States. And now there's discussions of the German government paying for 80% of the energy costs of industry, of heavy industry, which is a massive government subsidy. And obviously that weighs down on the taxpayers. So anyway, the point is that we're seeing a massive shift and a significant economic decline of Western powers and the rise of so-called emerging markets in the South. So because so many of these countries are capitalist, it's going to lead to contradictions. And we're already seeing those contradictions with India, for instance. Of all the countries in BRICS, India is the weakest link. The former Indian diplomat M.K. Bhadrakumar has been writing about this, he said India has the BRICS blues, especially now with the rise of left-wing leaders like Lula in Brazil. What we're seeing is India is really playing both sides. And in fact, Modi is visiting the United States this June. And of course, India is part of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is an anti-China NATO in the so-called Indo-Pacific region. It's India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And as we see the US militarization of the region, the creation of new military bases in the Philippines, move toward war with a war on China over Taiwan, whether or not BRICS continues as BRICS as we know it now is of course up in the air. But the point about it is not BRICS as an institution as it exists currently. It's about the creation of a new global South oriented bloc of countries that want to develop and have economic alternatives to the Washington consensus. That's what's important about it. And especially the creation of a new non-aligned movement, because that's essentially what we're seeing. The non-aligned movement was crushed largely by the United States and through, for instance, the coup in Indonesia against Sukarno and the genocide in 1965 and 1966 against more than 1 million people, between 1 and 3 million leftists in Indonesia who were just massacred. And Indonesia had been a significant leader in the non-aligned movement. And Nasser, not his death in Egypt. And anyway, the point is that we're seeing something resurge today. And that provides a lot of opportunities for the global South to develop, but also more importantly, it provides space for new economic models. Because in the neoliberal era, at the peak of neoliberalism, which is co-determinant with also the peak of US hegemony in the 1990s, it was almost impossible to try to develop socialism. I mean, Cuba survived, but went through the special period, which was extremely difficult. And you look at the sanctions on countries like DPRK, and I mean, the socialist government in Yugoslavia was overthrown. The Sandinistas lost power in 1990. It was an era of counter-revolution. And now what we're seeing is conditions that allow countries to pursue new economic programs. That was not simply possible in the 1990s. Finally, to briefly answer the question about Bitcoin and Paul Volcker and the US dollar as a reserve currency. I'll start with Bitcoin. I have little to no confidence whatsoever in Bitcoin and so-called cryptocurrencies, which are not currencies. They're speculative assets. Studies have shown that well over 90%, I've seen estimates as high as 98% of Bitcoin trades are pure speculation. It's for capital gains. It's not actually a currency. It's a speculative asset. And people, that's why if you listen to the rhetoric about Bitcoin, like HODL, hold on for dear life, that's clearly not a currency. If people are telling you to hold on to it, they're telling you to not sell your asset, which is, by the way, basically an unregulated security. And that's why I think it's actually good to see finally regulation over this insane deregulated casino landscape with all these fraudsters like, you know, Sam Bankman-Fried and others. Okay. Are there possibilities that cryptocurrencies could provide for countries to get around sanctions? Yes, but when it's directed by the state. The problem with Bitcoin, it is inherently a libertarian construct against the state. They don't believe in fiat currencies except the ones they create, which is the irony. They say it's not a fiat currency. It basically functions in the same way as a fiat currency, except it's not even really a currency. So it's the worst of both worlds. It's kind of a fiat currency and it's a speculative asset. So, I mean, but there are countries that are using cryptocurrencies potentially for international trade to get around sanctions. I don't think it's a long-term solution. I think it's a short-term solution because of the SWIFT system, because we still don't have the economic and financial architecture needed to get around US sanctions. The SWIFT system still is by far the most used interbank messaging system around the world. This is the interbank messaging system based in Belgium, controlled by the US. And it's what banks use to communicate with their transactions. So the US can kick out countries, for instance, Iran, Venezuela, and more recently, many Russian banks were kicked out of the SWIFT system. So potentially using cryptocurrencies as a way for countries to do trade. There are reports that Russia and Iran have been using it. Venezuela created its own cryptocurrency, but it's backed by the state and it's pegged to the price of oil, which is called the Petro. So that's completely different from the neoliberal model proposed by the Bitcoin enthusiasts. I have no confidence in them whatsoever. And whether or not, by the way, it's an open question whether or not Bitcoin was created by the CIA. No one knows who this guy Satoshi is. I'm agnostic on that question. And of course, the biggest beneficiaries of Bitcoin are drug cartels, money launderers, criminals, right? Okay. As for Paul Volcker, I mean, Paul Volcker, not only was he praised after the financial crash, he's being resuscitated now. He's being praised now, right? We see Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, has been basically seeing Paul Volcker as his model, and he's worried that he isn't raising interest rates enough. And Jerome Powell gave a press conference in which he said that his goal is to get wages down, just as Paul Volcker's goal was to get wages down, because all of these neoliberal economists, they see in consumer price index inflation as a problem with workers having too much power. They have to crush workers' power in the form of wages, which means they have to drop wages and raise unemployment. And you see people like Larry Summers, this neoliberal poster boy, who wrote by the way, when he was head of the World Bank, economist, he wrote this paper, this white paper, saying that the rich imperialist countries should export their pollution to the global South because, according to their economics, neoliberal econometric models, life is less valuable in the global south. So you should export all the pollution there to kill them, right? Well, Larry Summers recently gave an interview in which he said that unemployment needs to rise maybe to 10% or even higher, right? So Paul Volcker is being rehabilitated right now as we speak. And it shows that, I mean, as much as people like to say in the United States that neoliberalism is dead, I mean, we shouldn't be overly optimistic about that. I mean, it's dead in much of the rest of the world, but it still lives on in a kind of zombie neoliberalism. Finally, the question about the US dollar as the global reserve currency. I mean, what would happen if the US dollar ends as the global reserve currency? Well, one, it would be good for the rest of the world. And China has no interest in the renminbi being the global reserve currency, zero whatsoever. China is not going to lift its currency controls. It's not going to make it freely convertible. It's going to maintain strict monetary policy because China is not implementing neoliberal economic policies. And the central bank is not this independent neoliberal central bank like the neoliberals constantly tell us. We have to have an independent central bank, which means not democratically accountable, which means not implementing monetary policy on behalf of workers, but rather on behalf of the private commercial banks and corporations and hedge funds and the S&P 500, right? So in the context of what's going to happen, I mean, I think we're going to increasingly see a move toward a multipolar currency world. Yes, the renminbi is going to be used more. Also, the ruble is being used for trade, for instance, especially for commodities, buying oil and gas. India is using the rupee in its local trade. Iran is encouraging local trade in its currencies. So what we're going to see is a regionalization of trade. I mentioned the ASEAN countries are trying to use local trade for their regional trade. The US dollar is not going anywhere. I mean, there are people who say like, you know, there's going to be hyperinflation. The US dollar is going to be toilet paper. No, the US dollar is still, I think, probably for many years going to remain a significant global reserve currency. It's not going to be the global reserve currency, but it's going to be used probably as the plurality of the assets held in the foreign exchange reserves of central banks around the world with other currencies and commodities like gold. And we also see that many countries in the West that are basically kind of economically subordinated to the United States are going to continue to use the US dollar and hold on to US assets like treasuries. But we're going to see a significant decrease in the power of the US dollar. And that means that the US can't simply sanction the rest of the world into oblivion. More than one third of the global population lives in countries sanctioned by the United States unilaterally, illegally, in violation of international law. Countries representing almost 1/3, over 1/4 of global GDP. So, I mean, this is devastating to many countries. And as the value of the dollar eventually decreases, because it's going to lead to a depreciation of the US dollar, unless the central bank consistently just keeps interest rates high, which is going to have this catch-22, right? Because the Federal Reserve needs to keep interest rates low and maintain these quantitative easing policies to pump up the asset price inflation, which has been the leader of so-called economic growth, which has been a jobless recovery since the 2008 crash. It's all been growth in scare quotes in the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. So it's all just based on this big bubble of big asset bubble. It's not even just in real estate and stocks and bonds. It's everything. They call it the everything bubble. So the US has to either drop its low interest, its zero or low interest rate policy in order to lead to so-called economic growth, according to the neoliberal model, or it's going to face chronic inflation and other countries are going to de-dollarize more and more. So the US is in a serious catch-22. It's in a major economic crisis. And finally, what this means is it's something good for the US workers, but also bad for US workers. I'll start with the bad. With the decrease of the power of the US dollar, the US is going to have to reindustrialize, which is good for workers because it means there's going to be more and more jobs, and that's going to lead to more possibility for unionization and high quality, good paying jobs in industry, which was, many jobs in the 1960s and 70s before deindustrialization and outsourcing. So the US is going to have to reindustrialize. However, at the same time, as the dollar becomes less powerful and it's used less in international reserves, it's going to decrease the demand for the dollar. And especially as the Persian Gulf countries start trading their oil and gas and other currencies, it's also going to decrease the demand for the dollar. We already see that the UAE is selling liquefied natural gas to China in the Chinese yuan, and Saudi Arabia has expressed interest in doing so as well. So as there's a decreased demand for the dollar globally, it's going to fuel more inflation, and it's going to eventually, depending on what the U.S. Federal Reserve's monetary policy is, it's probably going to lead to a significant devaluation of the U.S. dollar, which does make exports more competitive. So it makes the possibility of reindustrialization more possible, but it also is going to be a blow to the purchasing power of U.S. workers. So U.S. workers are going to have to go back to a reality like in the 60s and 70s, where they can't simply maintain this massive current account deficit with the rest of the world, importing all of these cheap consumer goods from places like China. And that's the way that, despite the fact that U.S. wages have been stagnant since the 1970s, it hasn't been felt as much because of the very cheap consumer goods from Asia, particularly from China, but also from Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Central America as well. So it's going to lead to a decrease in the purchasing power of workers. But if it also leads to a deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, which is what it should do, then that means that we're going to see more economic possibilities for U.S. workers. So there are bad things for the U.S. It's for U.S. workers. U.S. workers have benefited from the massive deficit that the U.S. maintains with the rest of the world, but the most of that benefit has not gone to U.S. workers. It's gone to capitalists, to people holding their wealth in investment funds, and they're going to see a depreciation in their net worth as the U.S. dollar depreciates in value. So it's going to be good for the world. The U.S. dollar should not be the global reserve currency. We should welcome the resurgence of a more multipolar currency world, but it needs to come at the same time with reindustrialization and not this surfacization, like as becoming serfs, like with AI taking over all jobs and everyone just becoming, like an Uber driver.
That's a good place to end, I think. We're all going to be Uber drivers. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Elaine. This has been a pretty marvelous webinar. And, the War Industry Resistors Network hasn't had a conversation like this. Paul said we've had something like 10. We really had like 15 webinars, and they've all been around the war corporations, the Lockheed Martins and the Raytheon. Not all of them, I shouldn't say that. They've been around other tentacles of the military-industrial complex. But this one that we just did gets at a more structural thing behind imperialism, the finances and the economies of the world, and basically the neoliberalism that's driving the militarism and vice versa. So I appreciate this a lot. It's been a unique webinar. It's been the longest webinar we've ever had. All to the good. I will say we still have over 100 people with us. So you've got a lot of interest in this topic, and I sure appreciate all three of you, and I appreciate everyone who's been here tonight, and all of you who are still here. Let me remind you that we do monthly webinars, and our next one will feature Bruce Gagnon and Dave Webb doing one on the militarization of space. So thank you. In about a week or so, less than a week, I'll send out a follow-up email to all of you, and you'll get the recording link to this. And Ben and Elaine and Lisa, if you want to add any links to that email where people can look at things you've written or your website or any of that, send it to me by email, and I'll include it in the email I send out. So again, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. It's been a marvelous night, and have a good rest of your evening. And for you, Lisa, have a good rest of your day since it's morning there. All right. Good night, everyone.